I did not sleep that night either. Grief does not rest, it circles, it returns again and again to the same thoughts, the same images, until the mind is exhausted but never emptied. When dawn finally approached, it felt less like hope and more like intrusion, light daring to enter a world that had no right to continue. The Sabbath had ended in silence. No prayers had eased the ache. No words had made sense of what had been seen. The city had settled into its rhythms again, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred, as though the death of one we loved had been nothing more than another execution among many. But for us, everything had changed. I remember lying there, staring into the dark, listening to my own breathing, wondering how the world could possibly go on without Jesus. He'd been the centre of everything, our days, our questions, our hope. Without him, even memory felt unreliable, as though the past itself was slipping away. It was still early when I heard movement. Footsteps, soft, urgent, a door opening and closing quietly. I knew without seeing who it was. Mary Magdalene had not been able to wait. Love rarely can. Grief brings impatience to us all. I lay there a moment longer, staring into the dimness, my heart heavy with expectation I could not name. Something was stirring, not hope, not yet, but a tension I could not shake. It felt wrong to stay where I was, as though remaining still would be a kind of betrayal. Time passed, or perhaps it did not. Grief has a way of bending it. Then the sound came again, hurried now, uneven, breathless. Someone calling out my name, another one coming, and it was Peter. I was on my feet before my mind caught up with my body. "The stone," Mary gasped. "The stone has been moved. He's gone." Gone. The word landed like a blow. Not relief, not joy. Fear. Confusion. A fresh wound torn open before the first had begun to heal. My thoughts raced instantly to the worst possibilities. Had they taken him? Had even death not been enough? Peter was already moving. His face was set, his jaw was tight with something like desperation. I ran with him. The streets were quiet, washed in the pale light of early morning. Jerusalem felt hollow now, emptied of its tension, unaware of the storm gathering again just beneath the surface. We ran past all the shuttered stalls, past doorways still dark, our sandals slapping stone in the stillness. I remember being aware of my breath, the burn in my chest, the sound of Peter behind me, and then the strange awareness that I was pulling ahead. I did not slow down, I couldn't. Something compelled me forward, faster than fear, offering no explanation. When the tomb came into view, I stopped short. The stone was rolled away. Not cracked, not shifted, rolled. I stood there, suddenly afraid to go any closer, afraid of what absence might actually mean. Peter didn't hesitate. He rushed right past me, straight into the tomb, without a word. I followed a lot more slowly. Inside, the air was cool and still. The place smelled of stone and earth the way all tombs do. But something was wrong. Or perhaps something was right in a way I could not yet understand. The linen wrappings lay there, undisturbed, not torn, not scattered, but folded. The cloth that had been wrapped around his head was placed apart from the others, carefully arranged, as though death itself had been put in order and dismissed. No thief would have done this. No grave robber pauses to tidy things up. So I stood there, staring, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. Peter looked around bewildered, his brow furrowed in confusion and fear. He couldn't speak, neither could I. But something shifted inside me. I can't explain it fully, not even now. It was not certainty, it was not understanding, it was the first fragile crack in the wall grief had built around my heart. A whisper of possibility I was too afraid to name. I remembered words he had spoken, quietly, patiently, words we'd never truly heard, about rising, about life stronger than death, about seeds falling into the ground and bearing fruit only after they died. I'd dismissed them as metaphor. Standing there, staring at an empty tomb, metaphor suddenly felt inadequate. Peter left first, shaken. His steps were heavy, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of confusion had pressed him down again. I lingered a moment longer, my eyes tracing the place where his body had been laid. I did not yet know what had happened, but I knew something had happened. Outside, Mary stood weeping. The sound of it cut through me. Raw, unrestrained grief, unashamed and unguarded. She peered into the tomb through tears, her sorrow blinding her to everything else. I wanted to tell her something, anything, but the words just didn't come. How do you speak when you know you don't yet know what's true? I stepped away. My mind was racing. My heart caught between fear and hope, unwilling to embrace either of them fully. If he was alive, what would that mean? If he was not, why is the tomb empty? Nothing made sense. And yet, for the first time since Friday, the silence no longer felt final. It felt expectant. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, light spilled into places that had known only darkness. Jerusalem was waking again, unaware that death itself had been undone somewhere just beyond its walls. I did not see him yet. I did not understand yet. But standing there between an empty tomb and a grieving friend, I felt something stir that I thought had died within me. Hope. Fragile, trembling, uncertain, but alive. I left the tomb, but I could not leave the moment. My feet carried me away, yet my thoughts stayed behind, circling that empty space where his body had been laid. I walked without direction, scarcely aware of where I was even going. The city was waking fully now. Voices rose, doors opened, smoke curled into the morning air. Life went on, stubbornly, relentlessly, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But everything had. I did not yet know how to speak of it. I did not even know what I believed. Only that death no longer felt settled. The certainty that had crushed us all on Friday has now been disturbed, shifted, unsettled, like a stone rolled away, not just from a tomb, but from the soul itself. Mary stayed behind. I would later learn what happened next, how she stood there weeping, how grief blinded her to wonder, how love kept her near when logic offered nothing. But at that moment, I did not know. I only knew that I could not return to where we had been hiding and pretend that nothing had changed. I found the others eventually. They were fearful and confused, clinging to one another in that fragile way that people do when certainty has been stripped away from them. When I tried to speak, the words just tangled up. How do you explain an absence that feels full? How do you describe an empty tomb without sounding mad? I just told them what I'd seen, and I told them what I had not seen. They listened, but fear muffles the hearing. We were still men who had watched our teacher die, men who had scattered, men who had failed. Resurrection was not a category we knew how to even inhabit yet. Then Mary came. She burst into the room like somebody pursued, breathless, radiant, undone all at once. Tears streaked her face, but they were not the same tears she'd worn earlier. These were something else entirely. "I've seen the Lord!" The words fell into the room like fire. She spoke quickly, stumbling over herself, trying to contain the impossible. She told us how she'd mistaken him for the gardener, how he had spoken her name, how everything had changed in the sound of it. She told us he was alive. Alive. Some doubted, some stared, some wept openly. I said nothing. Not because I didn't believe her. I did. But because belief had not yet found its footing in me. It was growing, but still unsteady, like a newborn learning to breathe. That afternoon stretched endlessly. Every sound outside made us flinch. Every footstep felt like danger. We locked the doors, not knowing whether we were protecting ourselves from the authorities or from hope itself. Hope is frightening when you have already buried it once. And then without warning, he was there. No knock, no sound. One moment the room was full of fear and whispered speculation. The next, he stood among us. Jesus. Not a vision, not a memory, not a ghost shaped by longing. It was him. The whole room froze. Breath caught in our throats. Someone gasped. Someone else fell to their knees. I felt my legs weaken beneath me as joy and terror collided inside my chest. "Peace," he said. Of course he did. He always spoke peace into chaos. Always steadied storms, whether on water or in the human heart. His voice was the same, and yet everything about him was changed. He was alive, undeniably, gloriously alive, but not simply restored. Something had been transformed. Something had been completed. Something had been fulfilled. He showed us his hands and his side. The wounds were still there. That mattered more than I can ever explain. Resurrection had not erased the cross. Glory had not undone suffering. The marks of love remained visible, honoured, eternal. Joy broke over us then, unrestrained, overwhelming. Laughter mingled with tears. Fear loosened its grip. We spoke all at once, words tumbling over each other, questions unanswered yet somehow irrelevant. And he breathed on us. I felt it, the warmth of his breath, the intimacy of the moment. It reminded me of something older than memory, something woven into the very fabric of creation, life given, life restored, and life shared. Then just as suddenly as he had come, he was gone. The room felt larger and emptier in his absence, not because hope had vanished, but because it had expanded beyond the walls. Nothing could contain what had begun. Not everyone was there. Thomas had been absent, whether by accident or providence, I don't know. When we told him, his face hardened with grief disguised as reason. He refused to believe what he had not seen. I understood him more than I admitted. Belief is costly when it risks further heartbreak. Some days passed. They were strange days, suspended between certainty and waiting. We spoke often of what we had seen, replaying it from every angle, testing it against memory, against scripture, against fear. Each time we spoke his name, belief grew stronger, steadier, more rooted and grounded. And then he came again. This time Thomas was with us. And Jesus did not rebuke him. He did not shame him. He invited him to come closer. He offered his wounds without defensiveness, without anger, just with generosity. Thomas fell to his knees. My Lord and my God. I watched that moment closely, not with envy but with gratitude. Faith had found him not through certainty but through encounter, just as it had found all of us. After that everything changed, and yet nothing felt hurried. Jesus came and went, appearing where he wished, teaching still, restoring still, patient as ever. We learned that resurrection was not merely an event to be celebrated, but a reality to be lived into. And I began to understand then what the empty tomb truly meant. Death had not simply been reversed. Death had been defeated. What had been sealed was now open. What had been lost was now reclaimed. What had been broken was being made new. Not only in him, but in us. I did not yet know how far this resurrection would reach. I only knew that the world I thought had ended on Friday had been reborn on Sunday. And nothing would ever be the same again. It took time before I realised that resurrection does not rush. We expect it to arrive like a shout, sudden, overwhelming and undeniable. And there were moments when it did feel like that. The empty tomb, Mary's breathless joy, his sudden presence among us. But once the first shock passed, what followed was quieter, deeper and more demanding. Resurrection did not end our questions. It just transformed them. We were no longer asking whether God had acted. That much was undeniable. We were asking what it meant to live in a world where death had been defeated, but not yet erased. Where Jesus was alive, but not always visible. Where joy and uncertainty walked side by side, and faith required patience rather than proof. Jesus appeared to us often during those days, but never predictably. He did not return to us as he had been before, teaching daily, walking openly through the crowds. Instead, he came and went like dawn light through an open door. Always real, always present, always leaving us changed, yet still wanting more. When he spoke, we listened differently now. Before, we had listened as disciples hungry for instruction, eager to understand the kingdom he proclaimed. Now we listened as witnesses, men entrusted with something too large for words alone. He did not explain everything. He did not map the future in careful detail. He spoke instead about sending, about abiding, about bearing fruit that would last when everything else falls away. I began to see then that resurrection was not simply about his life. It was about ours. He showed us that life with God does not end in death, but neither does it retreat from suffering. His wounds remained visible, glorified, yes, but not erased. They were no longer marks of defeat, but testimony. Love does not forget what it has endured. Redemption does not deny pain, it redeems it. I remember one moment especially. We were together again, talking quietly, when Jesus looked at us, really looked at us, and said that as the Father had sent him, so he was sending us. The words landed heavily. Sending meant risk. It meant misunderstanding. It meant rejection. We had just watched where obedience could lead, and yet fear no longer ruled us, as it once did. Something had shifted permanently. Death had lost its authority. Even suffering had been redefined. It was no longer the final word, but part of a larger story we were only beginning to grasp. A story in which God brings life out of places we would have sworn were beyond hope. Later, much later, I would understand why the resurrection accounts differ in their detail, why no single telling captures everything. Resurrection is just too large to be compressed into neat certainty. It spills over, it overflows, it resists control, it refuses to be reduced to a moment rather than a movement. Even now, when I speak of it, I'm aware that words are just not enough. What I do know is this: the resurrection did not simply convince us that Jesus lives. It convinced us that love lives, that faith is not foolish, that obedience is never wasted, and that no action of devotion offered to God is ever lost, even when it appears buried, forgotten, and sealed behind stone. I think often of that first morning, how fragile hope felt, how hesitant belief was. We did not wake that day expecting victory. We woke when we were still wrapped in grief. Resurrection found us before we were ready for it. That too matters. God does not wait for our certainty. He meets us right in the middle of our confusion. In the days that followed, I watched fear loosen its grip on us. We still locked doors at times, still spoke in hushed tones, still glanced over our shoulder. But something stronger than fear had now taken root. Courage grew slowly, but it grew deeply, and it was anchored not in confidence, it was anchored in truth. Jesus' resurrection did not turn us into fearless men overnight, it turned us into faithful ones. There's a difference. Faith is not the absence of fear, it's obedience in the presence of fear. And resurrection gave us reason to obey, even when the path ahead remained costly and uncertain and demanding. I did not yet know where my path would lead. I did not yet know how long I would live, or what losses I would endure, or how many times I would have to say goodbye to those I loved. But I did know this: whatever waited ahead, it would not be meaningless. Resurrection had anchored our lives in eternity, and that changed everything. When I look back now, I see that Easter Sunday was not the end of the story by any means. It was the beginning of a new way of being human, a way marked by forgiveness rather than vengeance, by hope, not despair, by love that does not retreat even when it's wounded. Jesus did not rise from the dead so that we could escape the world. He rose so that the world would be renewed. That's what the empty tomb declared. Not only that he lives, but that life itself has been reclaimed, that death no longer defines us, that fear no longer gets the final word, that even the grave must eventually give back what it's taken. I've lived many years since that morning. I've watched brothers and sisters suffer. I've buried friends. I've felt grief return in waves that resurrection did not prevent. But resurrection has changed how I grieve. It has taught me to wait, to trust, to love without demanding guarantees. Because I now know what I did not know then. God keeps his promises, even when they appear delayed. Life wins, even when death looks convincing. Love endures, even when it's crucified. That is what Easter taught me. Not that everything becomes easy, but that nothing is ever truly lost. When that stone was rolled away, It was not only a grave that was opened, it was the future. And we've been living in its light ever since.